W.E.B.Dubois was the first social theorist to analyze the global racial order. He examined not just class, but how it intersected with the system of racism. His experiences in education made him fully aware of the color line and how it was distinct from class-based inequality. In The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois talks about how he first became aware that he was different from his classmates in New England when a little girl who was white rejected his visiting card, even though she was in the same economic class as Du Bois. He received a PhD from Harvard and was the first African American to do so in 1895. He also studied at the University of Berlin. He met Max Weber, whose own work on status group was clearly influenced by Du Bois. Among his published works, he wrote on the dual oppressions of women of color, including The Burden of Black Women and The Damnation of Black Women. He founded the journal Crisis, which is still often cited among scholars today. In the 1950s, he was targeted by the Justice Department due to his anti-capitalist and anti-war writings. He was fined $10,000 and 5 years in federal prison for not registering as a, quote, agent of a foreign principal. After a long trial, he was acquitted. At his arraignment, he stated, quote, "It is a sad commentary that we must enter a courtroom today to plead not guilty to something that cannot be a crime, advocating peace and friendship between the American people and the peoples of the world. In a world which has barely emerged from the horrors of the Second World War and which trembles on the brink of atomic catastrophe, can it be criminal to hope and work for peace?" The FBI spied on Du Bois following him to Japan and taking notes on his speeches. In their files that you can obtain through the Freedom of Information Act, it is written that Du Bois intends to unite the yellow and black races around the world. These files are public record, as are those on Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Du Bois' son, Burghardt, died at 18 months of age. His biographers, Manny Marable is among them, feel that this accounts for the sadder tone in Souls of Black Folk. The Souls of Black Folk is his most famous work. It was written in 1903 and is a compilation of 14 essays that Du Bois previously published in the Atlantic Monthly, The New World, and other journals. Historically, The Souls of Black Folk is important because it exposed an important intellectual and political schism in the Black community between the more moderate Booker T. Washington and more radical political activists such as Du Bois. When he was 92, the president of Ghana invited Du Bois to direct a major scholarly project, an Encyclopedia Africana, which he did after some prodding. He died at the age of 95. You may have heard this famous quote by Du Bois: "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in America, and the islands of the sea." Du Bois maintains that once the color line began to pay dividends through the colonization and exploitation of Africa and Africans, beginning in the 15th century, race became central to world history. In The Souls of White Folks, he states, quote, "The discovery of personal whiteness among the world's people is a very modern thing, a 19th and 20th century matter indeed. The ancient world would have laughed at such a distinction. Today we have changed all that, and the world in a sudden emotional conversation has discovered that it is white, and by that token, wonderful." Whiteness began to pay a dividend. We talked about this before, this dividend through the public and psychological wage. So in his book, Black Reconstruction, Du Bois notes, quote, "It must be remembered that the white group of laborers, while they received a low wage, were compensated in part by a sort of public and psychological wage. They were given public deference and titles of courtesy because they were white. They were admitted freely with all classes of white people to public functions, public parks, and the best schools. The police were drawn from their ranks, and the courts, dependent upon their votes, treated them with such leniency as to encourage lawlessness. Their votes selected public officials, and while this had a small effect upon the economic situation, it had great effect upon their personal treatment and the deference shown them. So the color line develops with the creation of whiteness when it becomes prosperous in tangible, economic, and psychological ways to identify as, quote, white. Now let's connect this to 1960s Baltimore, Maryland, where riots were occurring. In 1967, the Kerner Report documented the existence of two worlds. The Kerner Commission warned that the nation was moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Its recommendations: programs on a scale equal to the dimension of the problems, high impact in the immediate future in order to close the gap between promise and performance, and new initiatives and experiments that can change the system of failure and frustration that now dominates the ghetto and weakens our society. The Maryland Crime Investigating Commission report stated, "Our investigation arrives at the clear conclusion that the riot in Baltimore must be attributed to two elements: white racism and economic oppression of the Negro. It is impossible to give specific weight to each, but together they gave clear cause for many of the ghetto residents to riot." In response to the results of the Kerner Report, President Lyndon B. Johnson stated, "What did you expect? I don't know why we're so surprised. When you put a foot on a man's neck and hold him down for 300 years, and then you let him up, what's he going to do?" Art Cohen, a legal aid attorney in Baltimore, stated of the Kerner Report, "There had been this commission, and it came out with this report in March, just before King was assassinated. That report sounded a very loud warning, saying that what had happened in these cities was likely to happen in other places if some very great changes weren't made." King himself warned, "I don't like to predict violence, but if nothing is done between now and June to raise ghetto hope, I feel this summer will not only be as bad but worse than last year." Significantly, Du Bois predicted current conditions in his piece of The Sons of Master and Man, Chapter 9 in 1903.
Daily, the Negro is coming more and more to look upon law and justice not as protecting safeguards, but as sources of humiliation and oppression. The laws are made by men who have little interest in them. They are executed by men who have absolutely no motive for treating the black people with courtesy or consideration. And finally, the accused lawbreaker is tried not by his peers, but too often by men who would rather punish 10 innocent Negroes than let one guilty one escape. In explaining this unfortunate development, we must note two things. One, that the inevitable result of emancipation was to increase crime and criminals. And two, that the police system of the South was primarily designed to control slaves. I have said, the police system of the South was originally designed to keep track of all Negroes, and not simply of criminals. And when the Negroes were freed and the whole South was convinced of the impossibility of free Negro labor, the first and almost universal device was to use the courts as a means of re-enslaving the blacks. It was not then a question of crime, but rather one of color, that settled a man's conviction on almost any charge. Thus, Negroes came to look upon courts as instruments of injustice and oppression, and upon those convicted in them as martyrs and victims.
In addition, in the North, the concern was over preventing competition in employment and preventing the social movement of African Americans. Let's talk about what Du Bois says regarding the veil and double consciousness.
The Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil, and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder.
The veil has a couple of meanings. First, it refers to the literal darker skin of African Americans, which is the opposite of whiteness. Secondly, the veil suggests European Americans lacked clarity in viewing African Americans as true Americans. Double consciousness means that African Americans must understand their world and the world of the dominant group. They must navigate both. They must understand how they see themselves and how the dominant group sees them. For African Americans, being able to read the emotions of white European Americans and understand how white people see them is necessary for survival. Historically, African Americans had to be different. They had to know when to step aside, when to make eye contact, when not to make eye contact, because doing so could be very dangerous. This brings us to the less often discussed work by Du Bois, The Souls of White Folk. In it, he places the magnifying glass on whiteness. This piece was written after World War I, after African Americans had served the country and were hopeful to finally gain acceptance. Instead, they came home to a second-class status. Du Bois reverses the gaze, examining white consciousness, or the lack thereof, instead of black consciousness. While African Americans had a double consciousness, whites had no racial consciousness at all. Instead, whiteness is accepted as the norm. In this piece, Du Bois states, quote, "Of them, I am singularly clairvoyant. I see in and through them. I view them from unusual points of vantage. Everything great, good, efficient, fair, and honorable is white. Everything mean, bad, blundering, cheating, and dishonorable is yellow. A bad taste is brown, and the devil is black." This speaks to standpoint. Dominant standpoints are invisible because they are the norm until they are made visible. I'm going to share 2 articles with you in Blackboard, and I invite you to read them through the lens of Du Bois. The first article is a response by a biracial middle school teacher on the riots that occurred in Baltimore in 2015 after Freddie Gray, a 25-year-old African-American man, sustained injuries during police transport and later died as a result. This piece is called, "Dear White Facebook Friends, I need you to respect what Black America is feeling right now." In this article, the author is pulling back the veil. The author's experience is one in which she travels between 2 worlds, not just because she is an African American, but because she is biracial. Ultimately, it doesn't matter how she subjectively identifies within a racialized society, she will be placed into a racial category. She is aware at every age how European Americans view her. That's something she learns through experience and interracial interactions. She can never put her guard down. This double consciousness, understanding the worlds of both the dominant and subordinate group because it is a matter of survival, is not common among the dominant racial group. Whiteness is a standpoint that is invisible. She attempts to lift this veil of whiteness for her readers. The second article is called "Free Thought is for White People." In this article, the author, an African-American man, reflects on his experiences raising his daughter. He talks about the, quote, "oxymoron of making sure a person believes that the world provides them with limitless opportunity while ensuring that they understand the limiting reality of being Black in America. It is a precipitously thin wire that Black people must walk every day." He goes on to share his experiences trying to raise his daughter to feel free, but also to be aware of the dangers that face her. He supports her in all her endeavors, from fencing to making guitars to skating. One day he states, quote, "She was going to some cosplay nerd convention thing, and I asked her if she had her ID. She insisted that she didn't need it because she wasn't driving. 'Yes, you do,' I responded, 'just in case someone asks you for your ID. People can't get into trouble for not having identification if they're not driving,' she said, explaining how she had seen someone, probably some white person on YouTube, explain how it's unconstitutional to force anyone to give their identification. 'I know my rights. You don't need ID.' 'You're right,' I said. 'People don't need ID. You do.'" Here the author is lifting the veil for his daughter, and as he does, he faces how this double consciousness impacts parenting and how African Americans and other people of color are to navigate the dilemma of teaching freedom, individual creativity, and ability to their children, but also the realities of how racism restricts freedom. He begins the article by stating, "I am free. I am a Black man." And after this deep reflection on raising his daughter, he concludes with a story about a school walkout against gun violence. His daughter decides not to do the walkout. When he asks her why, she states, "I didn't do it because to me it wasn't really a protest." That's because this school walkout was organized and planned by the school, not a true protest by the students, organized by the students. He concludes, "My daughter is Black. My daughter is free."